Good morning. It's quite the introduction. Thanks for that. My name is Jackson 2bears, and Mohawk from Six Nations. I'm a media artist and sometimes writer, and currently working and teaching at the University of Lethbridge in the Studio Arts Department on Blackfoot territory. I want to be as succinct as I can because I only know I have 20 minutes, so I'm going to just jump right in. But before I do, I want to make a couple of acknowledgements to what I'll present today, which are essentially just some reflections on some of the commitments and goals generally from the summit. But I want to I'll make some proper acknowledgements as I go to some of the contributors in the paper, as I might normally do. But at the outset, I want to acknowledge a few colleagues and friends that I had conversations with over the last few weeks in preparing for this, and I really feel like their voices contributed significantly to this work, which I kind of feel is has a bit of a collective voice to it, and I want to acknowledge that up front to my friends and colleagues Ronnie Dean Harris, my colleague Janet Rogers, and of course Loretta Todd, who was very gracious with her time to speak with me last week, and we had a great dialogue. Tanis Nielsen, my partner Tanya, my friend Melody McIver, and of course a friend and mentor Leroy Littlebear. In this presentation, I want to specifically address one of the central goals and commitments of the Arts in the Digital World Summit. Specifically this, and this is a commitment, I'm going to read, it's an edited version, but to one of our commitments that I want to speak to today. Quote, we commit to supporting the ongoing relationship between Indigenous artists and Indigenous and non-Indigenous audiences for a shared future. The Canada Council is adopting an approach that respects and acknowledges First Nations, Inuit, and Métis artistic expression, cultural protocols, rights, traditions, and worldviews. This new approach represents a transformation in the way the Council funds, supports, and acknowledges Indigenous artists and cultures in Canada. It recognizes the cultural rights of Indigenous peoples and respects the principle of First Nations to self-determination. And when I began this, preparing this, I started with a very general question that maybe I'll pose at the end, but maybe something more interesting will come out as I'm giving this presentation. And I began with this. Our stories are written on the land. As Indigenous peoples, we keep our histories in songs, dances, ceremonies, and myriad other creative and cultural practices. The art of storytelling as an expression of our culture is for us embodied practice. This art of storytelling as an expression of our culture, so then, what are some of the challenges we face today in a society increasingly mediated by technology? How can the transformations underway in the arts sector work to empower Native people in this time of hyper-digitality and function as a tool to produce, preserve, as well as protect Indigenous knowledge? And what follows is broken into three sections, and I'll just dive right in without much introduction. The first section I've entitled FNMI, Creative and Cultural Practices in the Digital Divide. And I'm really happy that an earlier presentation has brought up some of these issues, and I hope that my presentation can provide a point of view on this as well. In terms of our commitment to amplifying the quality, scale, and sharing of art through digital technology, I propose that first we need to have an extensive conversation about access to technology. There are myriad studies that look at different marginalized groups and their limited access to technology, which involve things like access to computers, particularly internet connection and bandwidth accessibility, and generally the skills and training required to use technology effectively. And of course, this is what is known as the digital divide, and it is related directly to decisions made by governments and telecom providers in the designing and building of technology infrastructures. And now a lot of these studies, which I might provide in notes later on or in conversations, but many of these studies show, of course, that poverty and remoteness, particularly in FNMI communities, can prevent certain groups from engaging with technology in an equal capacity. So I really believe that our commitment must look at these disparities in different communities and in certain geographical locations with regard to limited access to information and communication technology. We really need to ask the question, I believe, will our commitments to this technological imperative further marginalize these communities? Will amplifying the scale and use of our digital technologies further amplify the disparities already present in the digital divide? Now, the Government of Canada has always presented itself as a leader, developing solutions, supporting infrastructure, the development of skills, and investing in building knowledge and networks in certain communities. But as was already kind of said earlier, I really do believe we need to look at the different strategies and assess not only their effectiveness in terms of a corporate kind of strategy, but also look at their code of ethics. So how can the transformations underway in the arts sector work to empower Native people in this time of hyper-digitality and function as a tool to preserve as well as create knowledge? I think here, for myself, we would do really well to think more deeply about the question of technology. As cultural theorist Arthur Croker once wrote about the idea of the technological imperative in Canadian culture and what he called the will to technology as that which operates under the sign of technological determinism. This is a question concerning the Canadian discourse on technology and digitality itself, which in many ways, I believe, is incommensurable, antithetical, and ambivalent to and with certain dynamics of FNMI knowledge and creative cultural practices. Again, as Croker wrote in his text, Technology in the Canadian Mind, I quote, "At work in the Canadian mind is in fact a great dynamic polarity between technology and culture, between economy and landscape. This is the gamble of the Canadian discourse on technology. What is at stake in the Canadian discourse on technology has always been the same. The urgent sense of the full significance of the fully realized technological society typified on the one hand by the haunting images of the information imperative and the politics of a general technological imperative which cannot be understood on its own terms, or rather within its own narrow frames of reference. Technological society incorporates at a fundamental level the received traditions of Western culture, and we might add perhaps colonial culture, and makes of our fate a journey into the unknown future." End quote. From my perspective, when it comes to the digital divide and the relationships to technology and culture, technology and the land, technology and the people, I believe we need to understand crucially the relationship between technology and power, and the history is plagued by technologies of erasure, of disenfranchisement, of marginalization, of colonial technologies of power itself. Here at this summit, I believe we have formed, optimistically perhaps, formed our commitment under the sign of what I would call technological humanism, where a commitment to amplify the quality, scale, and sharing of art in Canada through digital technology entails really a renewal of creative possibilities for artists in this society on equal terms. Our commitment here, as I understand it, is that which privileges the creative possibilities of the technological experience, and one that endeavors to shape new creative futures in a way that respects and acknowledges First Nations, Inuit, and Métis artistic expression, cultural protocols, rights, and traditions. It is a commitment based on, and I quote here Arthur again, expansive, pluralistic, universalistic, and the creative because it privileges the relationship, the interrelationship of technology and freedom, end quote. And I would add technology and possibility, technology and interconnectedness. But to beware, the perspectives that emerge under the sign of technological determinism are just the opposite. This is the, quote again, angle of vision of the technological experiences, which focus on technology as the locus of human domination and sublimation. And this is the critique of the relationship between technology and power, a critique of the digital divide and the technologies of disenfranchisement, marginalization, and erasure that for myself shore up against the entire edifice of colonial technologies of power and the loss of creative cultural practices. To paraphrase Arthur again, really an unleashing of the demonic and colonial forces deep within the culture itself, end quote. There's an important essay I read entitled The Digital Divide and the First Mile, framing First Nations broadband development in Canada that was written a few years ago, published at Simon Fraser University, which argues that the technological development in Canada must be reframed to address specific needs of First Nations. It says, we must reframe the decision-making process so that it emerges from within the rural and remote communities, such that it does not exclude those communities from participating in planning and implementation. It argues that we need to address the digital divide in ways that support community-based involvement, control, and ownership, particularly in the case of First Nations communities. And it is the only way, it concludes, does it hold the potential to, quote, move beyond the historical context of paternalistic, colonial-derived development policies in the context of digital technologies and broadband systems. Sorry, second section. Inherent Biases, and this is titled after an essay by Loretta Todd, so the section is called Inherent Biases, or Can Our Narratives, Histories, and Languages and Knowledge Find Meaning in Cyberspace? In her essay, Aboriginal Narratives in Cyberspace, Loretta Todd asked precisely, can our narratives, histories, language, and knowledge find meaning? And of course the short answer is yes. Yes, of course they can. Of course they have and will continue to do so. But the question is exceedingly more complex than it seems. I'll refer here to a moment by an essay by Sarah Diamond entitled Reframing the Cathedral, Opening Sources of Technologies and Cultural Assumptions, in which she writes, quote, technologies embody assumptions about the designer and audience. As designers and artists from diverse communities begin to construct virtual spaces, they seek expression from cultural differences that they live. These expressions require that technologies can be available and that tools and design methods must be adaptable in culturally specific ways, end quote. So if we ask, how can we develop innovative approaches to renew and grow our relationships in a digitally empowered, digitally enabled, mediated, controlled, determined society, we must first really consider the ways in which our digital aspirations involve being increasingly more adaptable in culturally specific and diverse ways. This is the question I would like to return to at the end. This is not really a new question, but one that has been under discussion since at least the early 90s. And again, consider Loretta Todd's essay, which I continually go back to whenever thinking these questions through. And here's a bit more of an extensive quote. What does the territory called cyberspace mean to Aboriginal people? Can our narratives, histories, languages, and knowledge find meaning in cyberspace? Will cyberspace enable people to communicate in ways that rupture the power relations of the colonizer and colonized? Or is cyberspace a clever guise for neocolonialism, where tyranny will find further domain? End quote. What I'm proposing here is really that I want to have a conversation about what I call the technological humanist approach, while being really critical of the will to technology and technological determinism, that sign under which the technological imperative reinstalls the codes of colonial tyranny, technologies of disappearance and disenfranchisement, and of marginalization. And of course, furthermore, following Todd, to really ask this question about our commitment to the seventh generation and really looking forward into the future. And by those of you that aren't familiar with that, when we ask this question of the seventh generation, we always implicate ourselves and hold ourselves responsible for all the choices and decisions we make now and how those will impact 7 generations into the future. In order to consider these questions, we need to take a step back, I believe, and ask, what inherent cultural biases might already currently exist, and what kinds of pragmatic, theoretical, and actionable discussions can take place to fulfill our commitment to shape a new, equitable, creative future? Here we are talking about the aesthetics of difference and about the inherent biases of technological systems at the level of the code, while making a commitment that will ensure these will not be duplicated and multiplied. This is, again, following Diamond, a central challenge we face in the context of creating space for Indigenous knowledge and what she called Indigenous aesthetics. And consider this too, a recent presentation I attended by Jason Lewis at the Crossing Boundaries Symposium in Lethbridge. And I quote, technologists rarely acknowledge the biases that infuse every layer. They are assemblages of biases that reify the imagination of their creators into executable code. This does not receive nearly as much attention as it should, how firmly our computational systems embed a certain worldview, a certain set of assumptions about humans and how we operate in the world, that we separate reasoning from emoting, that the human from the animal and from the natural, that our goal always is to dominate the world rather than live in it, end quote. And this approaches the larger question concerning the discourse, the Canadian discourse on technology itself. And from my perspective, this would be the main challenge we face today as FNMI people in a society increasingly saturated by technologies that import received traditions from a worldview that in the past has sometimes sought to erase and disappear our creative and cultural practices. A worldview that it would seem exists deep within the code that animates our entire technological world, that is not only incommensurable, indifferent, but one that is potentially dangerous to our creative and cultural practices. The answer, it would seem, is that Indigenous artists, creators, and designers need to become tool makers, as well as contributors and participants. And of course, many of us are. And I will point to, hopefully, if I have time, some examples a little while later that really explore the potential to provide new insights and exploring the limits and potentials of life in the digital era. I do believe, I will say at this moment, I believe if we are to live up to our commitments, we need to allocate resources to help FNMI individuals, groups, and committees construct our own infrastructures on our own terms, such that we might create, again, our own spaces in the digital world. And again, to quote Sarah Diamond, code as a language system reflects at least two cultures, that of the software and that of the coder's context, end quote. And so in her essay, which I will share later on, she points to artists and writers such as my friend Cheryl Rondell or Candace Hopkins, and she begins to talk about this idea of Cree++ as a new form of indigenous aesthetics as digital coding. And these kind of examples, she says, where digital language as a mode of creative and cultural expression can become a form of knowledge transference, as well as the content of our narratives. This remains, according to Diamond, a quintessential, I quote again, direct challenge for artists, writers, and others from indigenous communities who wish to express, or wish to use digital tools to express culture, end quote. And again, as a minor note, I would like to say that from my perspective, this all returns back to this relationship between technology and power, where we need to consider the links between technology and power, technology and culture, and technology and indigenous aesthetics. We need to, as Loretta Todd wrote, consider the future generations and try to foresee the possible consequences of reduplicating and repatterning inherent biases deep in the level of the code, and weigh these against the possible benefits and creative possibilities. And if you will allow me, I'll again end with a rather lengthy quote from Loretta Todd. What if each technological advancement, the question of its effect on the seventh generation, was considered? Some would say that this would limit development. On the other hand, could not such questions free us from the technologically deterministic models that seem to be so persistent today? Neither capitalism or Marxism feel the need to ask questions about future generations. Who considers the seventh generation when creating spaces and narratives in cyberspace? End quote. I see that I probably don't have time to go into these examples, all these examples, but maybe I'll just mention, because I had already was referencing Jason Lewis, but a really important project, I believe, that really exemplifies these kinds of ways of tool creating and knowledge making inside these digital worlds would, of course, be the project called Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, which is led by project lead Jason Lewis, housed at Concordia University, and with contributors Sky Winati, and some of you may know Stephen Loft also. So I encourage you to hopefully go look those up, and maybe I can share those with you at a later date. But in terms of time, I'd like to just end with this and kind of return back to this question. As Indigenous peoples, we keep our histories and songs and dances and ceremonies and myriad other creative and cultural practices. The art of storytelling as an expression of our culture is for us an embodied practice. So then, what are some of the challenges we face today in a society increasingly mediated by technology? How can the transformations underway in the arts sector work to empower Native people in this time of hyperdigitality and function as a tool to produce, preserve, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about how to protect Indigenous knowledge. I want to ask the question about Indigenous knowledge and creative cultural practices within this framework we've set up here at the Summit, and this transition and transformation of the Canadian arts sector in the digital era, and the idea of, quote, scaling up our use of digital technologies. And I want to return again to Sarah Diamond's question about the knowledge security, which has to do with the ability to constrain access of creative practices and cultural knowledge for certain groups. For example, she refers to things like sacred histories or sacred stories. While we envision our commitment to be that which would support the production, distribution, preservation of FNMI creative and cultural practices, we need to simultaneously be mindful of the protection of these things in this readily accessible, easily downloadable, and easily reproducible realm of the digital. This is the conversation about Indigenous aesthetics and cultural knowledge, and that of cultural appropriation and misuse. And I want to acknowledge a conversation I had with my colleague Janet Rogers, in which she offered a critique about some of these fundamental goals here of the Summit, while offering a cautionary note about digital technologies to disseminate Indigenous creative and cultural practices. Her conclusion was that we need to be careful and responsible with that which we produce and the knowledge we share, for, as she says, who knows who will receive it. She says, there is availability and over-availability. And some of you may know there's been a famous case in the news recently about the appropriation of cultural knowledge that was used to financially benefit an author that had no connection or accountability back to the communities he stole from. This raises the question about the protection of our creative and cultural practices and should force us to think about the need for a level of oversight in terms of being responsible about what is shared and with whom. And again here I want to acknowledge a conversation I had with my friend Tanis Nielsen, who is an Indigenous artist and academic, who spoke to me about the need for asserting an Indigenous governance over the dissemination of FNMI knowledge and information. And her concern, of course, was motivated by this recent story in the news about the dissemination of unreferenced and appropriated knowledge and the sharing of cultural stories that an individual did not get proper permission for. And I'm just going to quote, "I like to imagine our individual nations coming up with written constitutions, written natural laws that teach/tell others who are not from these nations the ethical process and ways of being good citizens upon that territory, and also the ways of governing the sharing of arts, culture, knowledge of that territory. Even when we do a Google search for images, the tools tell us, or let us know rather, the images that we are free to use and which images need to be referenced. She says, I'd like our nations develop these kind of sharing tools based on individual and natural laws." End quote. So what about seventh generation copyright, she says, which would be governed by the peoples of the nations in which the creative cultural practices and knowledge originated from? A process of accountability that, quote, respects and acknowledges First Nations, Inuit, and Métis expression, cultural protocol, rights, traditions, and worldviews. And I'm going to end with a couple preliminary conclusions and reflections, and then hopefully pose a question to you in this. In terms of our commitment to amplifying the quality, scale, and sharing of art through digital technology, I propose we first need to have an extensive conversation about general access to technology. So there's one question I might pose. We need to address the digital divide in creating actionable ways that support community-based involvement, control, and ownership. Again, another question that I'd like to ask. I'd also ask another question, again, about our computational systems and how they embed certain worldviews and how these may be potentially dangerous to our creative cultural practices. What can we do to overcome to make sure that these won't be duplicated and multiplied into the future? And finally, these are maybe, I was asked to ask one question, I'm asking four. But finally, and I'm deeply curious about this, because I should say I'm not an expert in any of these things. This is, for myself, I believe, the starting of a research project. And finally, I want to ask, as Loretta Todd had already done, but about our creative cultural practices, this imperative to the technological future, and thinking about the seventh generation and our impacts, our choices that we have now and how they will impact 7 generations into the future. And so with that, I'll close. Thank you very much. Now where to go? Mark.